Okay, I think we've had most of the people who are going to be able to joining live, and there might be others in the overflow room, as it were, watching the live stream. Welcome to this launch of the Walk Back Better manifesto, prepared by Paths for All, Living Streets and Ramblers Scotland, ahead of the Holyrood elections in May, assuming, of course, those go ahead as planned. We've had a fantastic level of sign-ups, over 160 people. We've got a full room here, and as I said, people also joining on the live stream. So welcome. I'm going to start just by introducing myself and the panel. So I'm Brendan Paddy. I'm the Director of Ramblers Scotland. Also with us are Stuart Hay, who is the Director of Living Streets Scotland, Ian Findlay, who's the Chief Executive of Paths for All, and Professor Nanette Mutrie is also joining us. She's the Chair of Physical Activity for Health at the University of Edinburgh, very involved in looking at the benefits to health from physical activity, but also very much in the public policy interventions that can help deliver that. I'll start with just a little bit of housekeeping and some introduction to the manifesto before we move on to hear from the panel in order. So just in terms of housekeeping, do please note that we will be recording the session. So you aren't going to appear on screen, so please don't be concerned about whether you've cleaned the room behind you. That won't be an issue. But if you do have a question and you do put your name to it, just be aware that that will go into the record, which will be made public. When we come to questions, and you're welcome to put those in at any time they occur to you, please don't use the chat. There's a function in Zoom webinars, bottom center, Q&A. Please use the Q&A. That's a better way for us to manage the questions as they come in. And I will be putting those to the panelists. Apologies for that, but it just can cause a degree of chaos if you invite people to ask their questions directly. So perhaps best avoided on this occasion. Other things to note, do please make sure that you give us your full name and organisation if you have one when you're asking a question. That's often very useful information to have, and do indicate if there's a specific speaker that you particularly want to answer the question. Otherwise, I'll use my judgment or just cast it over to everybody. Just to say that we're not expecting any problems with the internet or with the Wi-Fi, or indeed interventions from pets or children, but you never can tell. So we are just going to power on if any of the panelists are interrupted. The one thing I'm reasonably confident of is we have several hosts, so we should not be kicked offline. So I'm afraid if you disconnect, it's probably you, not us. So do just join back in. Great. So without further ado, I'm going to give you a little bit of context to the manifesto before I introduce it, the manifesto itself. So I guess the thing to say to start with is this is the first time, as far as we're aware, that there's been a walking specific manifesto for the Holyrood elections. And when we talk about walking, I should stress, whether we say so or not, we are definitely also thinking about wheeling. We absolutely want to include wheelchair users in this, who have many of the same issues, as well as some additional issues to people trying to walk around, particularly in our urban environments. I would also say that it's very much linked to the public transport, cycling and wider active travel and recreation agendas. There are separate manifestos for many of those things. We are not competing with those. We see those as being very much complementary. Many journeys that use other modes of transport often begin or end with walking, whether that's or other things. You probably noticed that there's a global pandemic on at the moment, and it's perhaps worth saying, of course, that all of this is happening in this context. One thing that has been particularly noteworthy about that, I think, is throughout the entire process, even from the various earliest stages, there was always an exemption to allow people to get outside for exercise. And that's been hugely welcome and hugely important. I think it reflects how important physical activity is for people's well-being, as well as for their health, and also how it can keep them connected to each other and also to the places where we live. And of course, it's also a comparatively very low risk when you're outside in open spaces if you keep your distance from people. As a result of that, we have seen 71% from people from the beginning of lockdown taking advantage of that exemption to get out, mostly for walking, but also for cycling and other activities. And by August last year, that had risen to 80%. And even now, when we're under this very tight lockdown, it's a real lifeline for many people, improving health, well-being, and as I said before, connectedness to other people and places. It's also really critical in terms of addressing health inequalities, because it's one of the few sort of interventions there that is accessible immediately to everybody without any special equipment and from the front door. It's for that reason, I think that people often do talk about it, walking as being the best buy in public health, with an extraordinary return on investment of up to 8 to 1 for some of the well-proven interventions that we are delivering. And it also generates an enormous amount for the economy, with an estimated 1.26 billion being generated to the Scottish economy by domestic and international walkers. And it's obviously also a critical part of any zero carbon future. So that's my little introduction of the context. But what about the manifesto itself? What are we actually asking for? So the first big ask is to deliver better access to walking for everybody. And I guess perhaps the most headline grabbing part of that is a request for £50 million a year for an infrastructure fund to improve routes, to make neighbourhoods greener, and to address issues that are arising in hotspots in the countryside that are under pressure. And to help make that happen, we want to see that money also used to deliver a job creation and skills program. The second half of improving access is to improve design, to make sure that walking and wheeling is safe and pleasant. And that includes things beyond just paths, because things like seatings, toilets, and street clutter are really important to make walking accessible to absolutely everybody. So that's the first one, making walking accessible. The second big ask is about making walking easy and enjoyable, because all the evidence is that's what actually drives people to do it and to keep doing it. It's not the long-term benefits, it's not the theoretical stuff, it's the experience you have when you step out your door. And so to help deliver that, we want measures to make sure that there is improved awareness of where and how people can walk, information, mapping, and promotional materials. Secondly, we want more 20-minute neighbourhoods. So at the planning stage when neighbourhoods are designed, making sure that people can reach the facilities they need every day by walking no more than 20 minutes, not having to get on a bus and certainly not having to get in a car to get to an out-of-town shopping centre or somewhere similar. And finally, under making walking easier and enjoyable, we want better funding for behaviour change, and in particular to make sure that walking is accessible to vulnerable people and those experiencing health inequalities. And the final big ask is to ensure walking is safe in every community. And so to deliver that, we want to see a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in all built-up areas, and also an enforced pavement parking ban that doesn't have a huge number of loopholes. And the second part of ensuring walking is safe in every community is investment in walking in schools, reducing congestion and pollution in front of those schools. So those are your headlines, but each of our speakers will go into some more detail. I'm not going to speak directly, but I will just make a couple of further notes before I hand over to Professor Nanette Mutrie. So I guess the first thing to say is, why is the Ramblers involved in this? People tend to think of us as mostly interested in hill walking and walking in the countryside. I guess I would say we recognise, and our members recognise, that the walks that make the biggest difference to the most people are the ones you do in your neighbourhood every day. And that's absolutely been everybody's experience in the towns and cities under lockdown, with people exploring the areas. Where and when you can go further afield, you obviously do, though, get a special kind of benefit to your well-being if you can get out in the forests, along the lochs and the rivers, up the coasts and up the mountains. And protecting those places is therefore really important. And those are also massively important to Scotland as a country, as a driver of our tourism economy. And we have seen a huge spike in visits to those places over the lockdown, which is really welcome. But it does mean that some of those places have come under real pressure. And I'm sure you, like me, have seen the headlines and the news reports, often suggesting that's a really negative thing. Obviously, those places being overwhelmed is negative, but the interest in visiting them is extremely positive, and we all want to make the most of that. And we are very pleased that although we have seen highlighted the lack of transport infrastructure, the lack of facilities, the lack of paths in many cases, Scottish Government has also seen that, and they are stepping up to begin to try and deliver that, with Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing leading a process with other relevant agencies and talking about investment to make sure that those places are enjoyable to visit and also protected from the risk that too many visitors will go there. And just finally, I do want to add, on mapping, I do have a special interest. Ramblers Scotland is running a project called Mapping Scotland's Paths, and that's because there is no definitive map of paths in Scotland, and we think it's really important that everyone has access to this information. And so if you keep your eyes open later in the summer, we'll be inviting anyone who wants to help us audit the map of paths that we've pulled together. And in some areas, we found twice as many paths as are on the readily available maps. So that's quite enough from me, and I'm now going to hand over to Professor Nanette Mutrie.
Oh, well, thank you, Brendan. Good morning, everyone. Brendan, that was a lovely introduction and context to this really important day in which we're launching the manifesto on walking for Scotland. So delighted to be involved, and I've got some slides to share. Um, by and large, to expand on Brendan's idea that walking is the best buy for public health. How's that? Can someone reassure me that you can see the screen? Great. So here I am, I'm talking the walk and trying to expand on the idea that walking is the best buy for public health. And let me put this in context. It's the best buy for public health in terms of promotion of physical activity. There are many aspects to public health, of course. One of them rightly is the promotion of active lifestyles. And walking, I think, can be rightly said to be the best buy. Why is this? It goes back a way. Here is the original article from Jerry Morris, who was famously the father of the world of physical activity for health when he did the London bus conductors and bus drivers study way back in 1953, showing that the conductors had much less risk of coronary heart disease than the much less active drivers. He has been a dynamite in our field, died recently, well into his 90s, but here in 1997, with his colleague Adrian Hardman, talking about walking to health. This is where it began, because people thought, well, walking isn't sufficient activity. In those 1990s, we may still have been embracing fitness and the need for very vigorous activity for health. Jerry Morris went, no, there's tons of health benefits to be gained, and they said in that paper that walking's the nearest activity to perfect exercise. So this is because it uses all the major muscle groups, it uses balance, it uses the core muscles, and we're mostly outside doing it. He thought, there it is, we don't need skill, we don't need facilities, most everyone can do this, and put this statement in which we're all still benefiting from. So why are they the best buy? Well, I think walking and wheeling, and we do want to include that, has the potential for the biggest reach into the population. Now, personally, I love sport. I play golf, I've played squash, I play a funny game called pickleball. I like cycling, I commute, there's swimming going on, I love going to the gym, but none of them have the big reach into the population that walking has. That's why it's the best buy. But the other things are not unimportant. And indeed, we might walk to do some of them. Golfing is, in fact, a walking sport, of course. So it reaches all ages. We can do it for leisure or transport. And it's certainly, as Brendan said, extremely important currently, but it is also the most popular mode of activity. So that's like taking the low hanging fruit, if you like, using what people are doing, trying to get more people involved. It's also the mode of activity most likely to minimise inequalities. Now, in Scotland, from our Scottish Health Survey, we see a modest 4% increase from about 2012 to 2019 in the percentage of our population achieving the recommended minimum of 150 minutes of activity each week. That's great news for Scotland's policy. However, where we're not doing so well, and I've just realised I've spelled inequality wrongly there, please forgive me for that, is on these issues of inequality. Now, most people, when we talk about inequality, think of deprivation versus affluence, and that's measured by the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, SIMD. Yes, there is a gradient there. There is, that the more affluent do more walking. There is a difference between the percentage of men and women, but it's small. And the age difference in walking isn't as great as it is for other types of activity either. So walking's the mode of activity most likely to minimise these major challenges to equality that we have in physical activity. And of course, the pandemic is likely to have exacerbated these inequalities. Now, here's some evidence about the role of walking from the Scottish Household Survey. I think it's important to try and always use surveys that have national representation, and this is one of them. So if we look along the bottom, we've got the years that the survey has been taking place and the percentage of adults who have participated in the last 4 weeks. So it's not exactly the public health guideline, but it's an indication. Along the top, we see a little modest increase there from 73 to 80. So that goes along with the Scottish Health Survey's more specific report on who reaches the 150 minutes. And if we look at the very bottom line, we see all these activities excluding walking. Well, it's not having such a rate of increase. What is increasing, according to the Scottish Household Survey, is walking. Walking may well be driving the increases in physical activity that we see in our population, again, making it the best buy. And walking has all the health benefits of our other activities. This is what Jerry Morris was trying to say in his original paper. It has all these benefits that physical activity in other modes can also deliver. And more recently, some work we've done ourselves at the University of Edinburgh has shown there's now good evidence that walking has mental health benefits. Probably the strongest of that is treating and preventing depression. But the more immediate things of improving mood and getting into the outdoors, bringing additional mental health benefits, now has strong evidence. Then, in a celebration of the original 1997 paper by Morris and Hardman, the British Journal of Sports Medicine issued a special edition all about walking in 2018. And the editors of this special edition said a bit more than Morris did. They said, well, Hippocrates all that time ago said it's man's best medicine. But they're saying now walking is humanity's way to a better world. Well, this is a big statement. Humanity's way to a better world. Well, what on earth do they mean? I think what they're meaning here is that walking in particular can have a role to play in reaching the sustainable development goals set for a better world. Now, this little diagram I've got in front of us here comes from the International Society of Physical Activity for Health, and they picked out these 8 sustainable development goals that have particular role for physical activity. And if we look at them, we can see again why walking might be the best mode of activity to achieve some of these development goal aims. Obviously, health and well-being right in the middle. Education, we need education about walking around schools. We need gender equity. Walking is less gendered than other activities. Reduce inequalities. Sustainable cities and communities. Of course, when we're in the pandemic and discouraged to use public transport, the temptation is to jump back into the car. But if we can now promote walking at this point, we might have a big role to play here in climate action, on life in the land, and on peace and justice. So I think for these reasons, we can comfortably say that walking really is the best buy. And if you wanted to hear more about that particular approach, I did a blog with the British Journal of Sports Medicine on this topic, and Danny is going to put the link for that in the summary of today's activities. So thank you. I think your role now is to try and support and promote this manifesto and help make more walking happen in Scotland. Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you, Professor Mutrie. Ian, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Brendan, and good morning, everyone. And thanks, Nanette, for that, because that just sets the scene perfectly. Walking best buy in public health, and walking requires infrastructure. So I'm going to focus in on the £50 million infrastructure fund. So as Brendan said at the beginning, many of us have enjoyed walking more during the pandemic. especially during the lockdowns. But importantly, not all of us have. And although we do have lots of paths and we have excellent access rights in Scotland, many of us who have been out walking will have noticed that the walking and wheeling infrastructure could do with being improved at times. Improved, as Brendan said, to make it more accessible, to make it safer, and to make it enjoyable for everyone, and I stress the everyone there. And that is what this fund is all about. It's about improving paths and pavements. It's about creating new paths and pavements where they are needed. It's about specific improvements required to make paths and pavements accessible to everybody. So it's about lighting, it's about toilet facilities, it's about drinking water, rest areas, shade and sheltered areas where appropriate. It's all about better signage and information, and it's about walking and wheeling links to and from public transport. And it's also this infrastructure fund about creating jobs and developing skills. So that's what we're planning with this infrastructure fund. Now, £50 million per annum, that does sound like a lot of money, but let's just have a think about that. First of all, I'd like to just put that in perspective. So likes of the Sheriff Hall roundabout proposal, it's got a price tag of £120 million. So that's over twice £50 million. Julian, the A9 between Perth and Inverness has a price tag of £3.3 billion. So that's 66 times 50 million. Now, I'm not commenting on the desirability of these large infrastructure projects. I'm purely wanting to make the comparison between these infrastructure projects and the walking infrastructure project. Another way of looking at it is £50 million is only £1.5 million per local authority and national park area per year. So it's a relatively small sum of money. But probably most important is, what about its value for money, which Brendan did touch on at the beginning, and Brendan mentioned a number of social return on investment studies that show that for every £1 invested in walking and wheeling, there's an £8 return. Now that is actually a very high cost benefit ratio. That is a really good return on investment. But most importantly, I think, is we see this fund as a short-term spend for a long-term gain. And in the long term, I think we believe that this is a net saving to the public purse. Now, why do we think that? We think that because it's preventative spend, as Nanette was talking about. We'll all remember the Christie report, and then just last week, the Social Renewal Advisory Board produced their report, and they emphasised the importance of preventive spend. So from a public perspective, public health perspective, if we invest now in keeping ourselves as happy and as healthy as possible, and for as long as possible, we will actually significantly reduce our burden on the likes of the National Health Service and the costs of inequality. So what we're talking about here is really social prescribing. It's social prescribing. It's also thinking about COVID-19 boosting our immune system. We know that physical activity, we know that walking immediately and significantly boosts our immune system. So to go back to what you've already heard a couple of times, what I think the Faculty of Public Health maybe said first in terms of physical activity, talking about walking as the best buy in public health, we really do believe this relatively modest £50 million per annum spend on walking and wheeling infrastructure in Scotland does represent best value for public health. Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I'm now going to pass over to Stuart.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. This is a really important day for all the charities involved, including Living Streets. Yeah, we're putting walking on the map today, and I think it deserves to be there. I can simply say walking is magic. It just sort of happens. And there is no downsides to what walking can do for you. It's incredibly space efficient. It's incredibly cheap. And like all magic things, it can sometimes be invisible. And I think that's one of the challenges we have. And so it's often not thought about or understood. So today is quite important to say this is important. We do need, as Scotland, to think about how we create a walking nation. The main point is it is a serious form of transport. 48% of journeys under 2 miles are by foot, and that compares with bike, which is only 2%. So then, and that needs to be much higher as well. But walking does need to be invested in, and it's 22% of all trips that are recorded in the Scottish transport statistics. But again, that's probably an underestimate, because if you think about every journey to a train station or to a bus stop probably involves some degree of walking. So walking is really, really important. But it's more than just transport. I think this is one of the other challenges we face. It's about people and places and the place agenda. And that's why I think public policy struggled with this. It doesn't fit into silos. It sits in a lot of different areas. It sits in public health. It sits in transport. It sits in placemaking. It sits in planning. And one of the challenges we had, because we have seen as partly as transport, is actually it's been engineered out of our lives in a lot of ways, substituted with car journeys, which actually squeeze walking out in terms of space, in terms of the comfort we face. Now that's changing, and I think that's one of the really positive things that we've seen in recent years. And COVID sort of reinforced that in terms of seeing what quieter streets can feel like when you're not fearful about crossing the street, when you've not got the traffic noise. Neighbourhoods can feel different. So we need new ways to promote walking, and we need new ways to reconnect communities within themselves and with other communities, and walking can do that. And that's really what this manifesto is about. And we've recommended a few headline areas where we think there's easy wins. I'm going to pick out a few. First of all, we need to plan our communities better. We've lost a lot of facilities over the years. Places you used to be able to walk to are no longer there. They're probably somewhere on the edge of town that you have to get there by a car. So we need to fix that. And again, we've seen that communities that have had these facilities, that have had their corner shops, have been able to deal with COVID much better. And the 20-minute neighbourhoods concept is really, really important. But we also need to think about less affluent areas, more deprived areas, and what facilities they actually have in terms of the quality and choice of facility that is there, including the public transport links that people have access to. We need to change behaviours, and that is about putting walking up there. And I would start with children in school age. Already about 50% of kids walk to school or take active forms of transport. And really, we haven't done that much over the last 20 years to change that. We've got relatively small programmes to promote schools walking. Out with the school, there's the Daily Mile, which is really, really positive. In with the school, so I think we can upscale these things. You get 5 to 10% uplift in terms of levels of active travel, and we need to go further in terms of making those streets safe. They're already 20 mile an hour, but they're not actually particularly pleasant places, and they're normally full of cars dropping people off and things like that. So the councils that have done a good job on this have already started to look at closing these streets. So we need more of that. We need to feel safe when we're walking, and the easiest way of doing that is the 20 mile an hour limits in all urban areas. Residential streets, shopping streets. Edinburgh has already done it. Borders this year has done it in all its villages. So there's an urban example and a rural example, and Glasgow's working its way through that. We just need to be consistent across the whole of Scotland, and we do need to enforce that and create the behaviour change behind that. Some of the streets don't lend themselves to 20 mile an hour yet, but it's definitely a building block for walking. Little things, we should fix our crossing times. Why does it take so long to wait to cross the road? Why when you get to cross the road, do you have so little time? That's an imbalance. It actually costs nothing to fix that, and there would be a downside for vehicles, but it's a rebalancing, and it's about this issue about re-engineering walking back into our lives when it's been re-engineered out. And we need to reclaim our pavements. And the footway parking ban was one of the great achievements of this Parliament, which has kind of become a little bit stuck because of COVID. It needs to come back. The local authorities need to get behind it, and we need to clear pavements. And we've had a lot of inquiries from people wanting to see this happen, especially this year. They've been waiting for it. People about being out walking more, social distancing, the need for space is more important. So that's one of the aspects of COVID that's come out of this is having good space in local areas where you can walk. And finally, I'd just say walking isn't an add-on. It is core to a lot of other policies. It's fundamental to public health, has been explained. It's also fundamental to air pollution at a community level, climate change emissions, if we're going to tackle these short journeys, which are also the most polluting journeys. These are where cars and vehicles are least important. And finally, if we want to revive our town centre, our town centres have taken a battering. There's no question. We're hearing about big stores just today that may not come back. We need to we need to create reasons for people to go into, and we need people to walk around. And I think if we're measuring how good we are at rebuilding back better, it will be built on footfall, other people in the streets walking. And I think that should be a core for this, and that should be a takeaway from this manifesto. So please read the manifesto. Lots of good actions in it that we all share. We hope you'll share them too. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and also again to Professor Mutrie and to Ian. So with that, without further ado, what I'll do is start looking at some of the questions that are already starting to come in. Do put those, as I said at the beginning, in the Q&A, which you can find at the bottom centre of your screen, and I'll be reading those questions and putting them to the panel. So I thought I'd start with one which I know will concern a lot of people, which was, we had Anne Tyler asking about controlling urban speeds and the role that plays in making walking environments better and safer. And she did mention a specific initiative called the Community Speed Watch. And so, Stuart, you perhaps might be better placed than most to give us any comments, but I'd welcome comments from others too.
Yes, I agree. I think this is something that we do need to see up as a higher priority. Road policing again is something that's been cut back because of austerity, and I think if you actually start tackling these issues, you probably address another of other issues in the criminal justice system. People generally committing crimes need ways of moving about, and if there's more visibility of policing, it will help tackle that as well. So we need to tackle in specific places. And there's a general re-education. So I would always say education first and enforcement last, but I think the enforcement is lacking a little bit. I think the police do the best with the resources they have, but there isn't enough resources at the moment. If you look at somewhere like the A9, where they used automatic cameras, it massively improved compliance. So we should look to technology as well to fix this problem.
Fantastic. And is there anything that you or anybody else can add about the roles communities themselves can play in helping reduce speeds?
Yeah, I think that is something that Police Scotland has looked at, and I think it should come back in terms of making sure those schemes are sort of well managed and they are genuinely community led and they have the right messages and things like that. So yeah, definitely, I think that would be something we want to see more projects on, delivered well with communities.
Fantastic. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Rosanna Rabajes. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name, Rosanna. Rosanna was asking about the pushback that we've seen in places where temporary improvements have been made to make active travel more comfortable, safer and easier. So I wondered if anyone had any reflections on how we can resist those challenges and hopefully see some of the positive changes that have been made permanent.
So I just jump in again. I think there's a big challenge here because basically our streets have been the same for 40, 50 years and people have got used to them, and certain privileged minorities actually have got used to doing what they like on these streets, and that's being challenged and they don't like it. But that's understandable. That's human psychology. So there is a lot to be done in terms of the behavioural science of getting these changes communicated and how we communicate them. And I think one of the challenges during COVID is actually bringing people together to discuss things at a community level has been much more difficult. But these are all test and learn activities, and I think the majority of these schemes are really, really good. And even from the ones that have come out, we should be learning things about them. So yeah, it is a concern, and I don't think you should judge all these schemes just on the COVID ones, because they were done quickly, they were done as temporary measures. I think the better example is, how does the place feel, and are people using them? If the place feels better and people are using them, then they should keep them.
Can I just add a small bit?
Go ahead,
Brendan. Yeah, I know that Transport Scotland are seriously looking at this and trying to support local authorities to make those temporary changes more permanent where, as Stuart says, it has been proved to be popular and people are using them. And so people are really trying to make this happen. So locally advocate to your local authority to maintain those temporary structures where you think they're working well.
Very good.
Yeah,
Thank you, Professor. Oh, go ahead, Ian.
And I think we need to look at the widest possible benefits of walking, wheeling and cycling. You know, as Nanette showed in the slide of the Sustainable Development Goals, walking, wheeling, cycling is actually a really good example of the sort of systems change that we're all talking about now, because it cuts across so many policy areas. So walking and cycling is not just for recreation, it's not just for active travel. It helps solve air pollution, it helps tackle climate change, it helps deal with inequalities, it helps generate economic activity. So there's a whole range of benefits arising from these sort of road reallocation schemes, and having a better balance between motor vehicles and walking, wheeling and cycling. But change is always difficult, and you know, and it will take time to change behaviours. But I think it represents a really quite a fundamental and very positive change in a whole number of areas for our communities.
So the next question I'm going to take is from Peter Monk, because it kind of follows on and away from this, and it's an old chestnut for all of us, which is to do with the potential conflict between walking and cycling. And Peter notes the evidence, which I think we'd all agree with, that probably even more so than cycling, walking has, in most circumstances, the potential to offer really significant benefits. But Peter's suggesting greater restrictions, therefore, on cycling, particularly where there might be conflict with pedestrians. So Ian, you and I have discussed this at some length, but perhaps Professor Mutrie, do you have any observations on that, or is that one you'd prefer to stay clear of?
Well, I'll start briefly if that's okay, but I think others can pick it up. I'm not sure that that's what NICE's conclusion meant. It didn't mean that. It meant local cycle infrastructure for public bodies to invest in, like extra cycle locking and locking up your bike safely and showers and so on. But I think that evidence is quite old now and may well have been superseded. And so I don't know about the next sentence coming into the infrastructure debate. So I think the others can now pick up that argument between cycling and walking for me.
Thank you for that comment on the evidence, though. That's very helpful. Ian, any thoughts?
I think we need to keep things in perspective here. It doesn't matter what walk of life is, conflict tends to grab the attention more than when things are just working well. So I think we need to keep it in perspective. There is definitely flashpoints and bits of conflict, but I think we can overplay it. And I think if a combination of everyone being, well, sticking to the law, being respectful of everyone else, which is, you know, this is parallels with the access legislation, and also that the infrastructure is appropriate for walking and cycling. Sometimes cyclists don't have a choice, but you know, if we get all these bits in place, I think we can overplay the conflict thing. And just like we've seen with the access legislation, many of us involved in the access legislation, if you go back to when it started, there was a lot of worry that it was going to cause a lot of conflict in the countryside. And, you know, it really hasn't. I mean, there's been an odd case, but on the whole, it's worked really well. And it's worked because people have shown respect for each other. And I think we just need to apply the same here in our communities with walking, wheeling, cycling, and vehicles. If we're all respectful to each other's needs, and then I think that goes an awful long way to mitigating this small amount of conflict that there is.
Thank you, Ian. And I would, of course, concur. The next question I'm going to take is one which raises a new issue, which I think it'd be interesting to explore. So Alistair MacDonald had asked about parking and the role that plays in promoting walking or not. He's done so in the specific context of parking at schools for teachers and the example that sets. But I think there's a wider point there about the priority given to parking versus the priority given to space for walking. Stuart, perhaps that's one you would like to chip in on.
Yeah, it's a hot topic for me. I recently, before lockdown, went for a walk to my old high school, and there's the headmaster got his parking space, the deputy headmaster, and they all had their parking spaces right at the front door, and it wasn't a brilliant pedestrian environment anyway. But yeah, I think there is an issue around about parking that we need to grasp, and we can dance around about this. We have too many cars in Scotland. There's just no way of getting around about that, and most of them aren't used. That's why there's a parking problem. 95% of the time they're not being used. They're sitting on street, and that's a drain on the economy. It's a drain on people's personal finances. So we should be looking to reduce people's dependence on cars. Look at car clubs as well, and those sort of things at a community level. In a lot of places, you don't need to own a car if the alternatives are good enough, and there's things like car clubs there. And that's not to say that you shouldn't, but it's multiple car households is when you really put pressure on communities, and we need to work out what's went wrong in these communities. So yeah, I think we can't do this without tackling parking. We can't create the space to put in the infrastructure unless we remove parking spaces, and it's the laws of space where we've got to deal with this. So yeah, there's no easy answers, but actually we just do it, and I think it's one of these things. There will be a political pushback, but once it's happened, people kind of forget about it rather quickly. There's probably lots of parking debates from years ago that we've all forgotten about.
Ian, you were looking to chip in too, I think.
Yeah, just to pick up on one point Stuart made there, and that is if the alternatives are good enough, which is a critical bit, and that takes us back to this infrastructure fund. That's what the infrastructure fund's about, is making sure that the infrastructure for walking, wheeling, cycling, public transport is as good as it can be. I mean, basically we need to make these other modes of travel delightful compared to using the private car. And our job will be so much easier in shifting all of us. I mean, I'm a car driver myself, shifting all of us from our private cars onto these other modes of getting about if the infrastructure is safe, accessible, and enjoyable. It's an enjoyable experience. And so, yeah, these alternatives to the car need to be good, and that's what the infrastructure fund is all about.
Great. And that leads us on to another question, which I hope you could shed some light on, Ian, but I think perhaps Professor Mutrie may also be able to contribute. We won't, I would stress, get through all the questions. I'm trying to get a range of questions from a range of questioners. This one is from Simon Pilpul. He's from Lanarkshire Council, and he's asking a little bit more about your suggestion, Ian, that we would have some kind of task force to oversee the management and delivery of this £50 million per annum infrastructure fund.
Yeah, okay. Hello, Simon. I don't think I did mention some form of task force, but we do really need to think carefully about how we will implement this fund. And there's various options. One option which is tried and tested, with Sustrans and Pass for All, is that you have a managing body that then grant aids others to deliver, whether that be local authorities, community trusts, NGOs, public bodies. So I think that could be one vehicle, is the money would come into a central fund, there'd be criteria set, and then that fund would be dispensed according to those criteria to a range of organisations. But at this stage, we're just trying to get traction for this, the concept that we need to invest in walking and wheeling and cycling. And once we get that, then we will think more detail about how exactly that we will go about managing that. But there's tried and tested routes which are good value for money, that are working well, that we could use.
Thank you. Anything to add, Professor Mutrie?
Not to this idea. I think we have in Scotland task forces for a number of things, and that will work well. So just to echo Ian's comments, really.
Very good. One where I hope perhaps you might be able to highlight any evidence that's relevant, although I don't mean to stretch your very broad knowledge, but we had a question from Jane Young, and she was asking specifically about whether actually where people are walking more often, that we see reduced littering, crime, and generally less antisocial behaviour. Is that something that you can shed any light on?
Yes, I think Jane is correct. There is good evidence for this. The more people who are on streets, the less crime, the less littering, the less antisocial behaviour that occurs. We do have evidence for that. And we also have evidence that pedestrianised areas actually are better for the local shop economy, against what many shop owners felt, that, if you'd stop people parking right outside my shop, I'll lose my business. Instead, it's all about footfall, people going past more and more and more. Is good for the economy, it's good for the local neighbourhood. People feel connected and in charge of their neighbourhood in that sense. And along with that control part, I was interested in someone's comment about the pedestrian crossing button. Yes, now if we gave pedestrians the power to just change that traffic flow and stop when they press it, that is empowering. And the one right outside my offices at Edinburgh University do that. It stops all the traffic in Holyrood Road and there isn't a problem. But the one outside my home here in Glasgow makes me wait sometimes 5 minutes while the road is empty. So that sort of empowerment to pedestrians is an important part of the issue as well. And the other one that I might be able to pick up is about the noise of traffic. And in the manifesto and in other places, we're saying to people, find activities that you enjoy. Indeed, even more than that, that you find joyful, because these things are the things that are associated with our intrinsic motivation to do them. When we go towards that end of motivation, we might go back and do it very regularly. When we're forced to do it or we don't quite have that joy, it's always harder. So the noise of the traffic is stressful. And yes, public health would be concerned about those stressful noises if you were in a street with high levels of noise pollution. So ways of reducing that, of keeping traffic out of pedestrian areas, just as we've seen with some of the temporary closures, is another way forward, not only to help more people walk, but to find enjoyment in the environment that they're walking in.
The first instance of a speaker on mute. Thank you, Professor Mutrie, and to David Leslie for that question about noise. We are just running out of time, and so I did want to ask one question which I thought sort of raised an interesting point about how we frame these discussions, and that was Becky Cox saying, can we focus on physical infrastructure as a core building block of improving the walking environment? She's a bit concerned that, all of the language about making places greener and tackling climate change, and I presume 20-minute neighborhoods and all the various other models and descriptions that we have of these things might be distracting from the nuts and bolts of things. Ian, Stuart and Nanette, you've all been in this game much longer than I have. I wonder if you could sort of comment about how we think about and how we describe the changes we want to see on the ground. Stuart?
Yeah, I think this is a fundamental point that, and this is maybe the importance of the manifesto, the fact that we put a bit of a price tag on this and saying we need some cash behind this, because it's not just about saying people walk in areas that are nice. And there's a lot of areas in Scotland that are just not nice. And we know that from street audits. And we know what needs to be done. And we present reports to councils. And at the end of the day, they just don't have the resources to do it. There actually is a willingness amongst the officers to do this. So finding some resource, the behaviour change stuff's important, but it goes hand in glove with actually creating a network. And I think there's an overestimate of how good the network is out there. There is pavements, but they're not actually accessible to everyone. And there is, if we want people to walk with it, is actually a lot of people will say they'll walk about 15 minutes to facilities. Now that's fine, but actually we want them to walk further for their health, and because it's cheaper to have fewer facilities, if you like, they're going to be more viable. But I understand why people probably stop because they hit a major road junction and all these sort of things. And we just need to put some money into the network. We still haven't got drop curbs in all our communities, and that's just scandalous. It really is scandalous. If you can, that means that there's just places where people on wheelchairs cannot go. And similarly with tactile paving, this is not high-tech stuff. This is just a guy with a spade that goes out and knocks down a curb and reinstates it. And we should just have a mass program on that, and it create lots of jobs, and the accessible benefits to everybody would be fantastic.
Nanette, Ian.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the physical infrastructure is absolutely fundamental, and that's why I think in the manifesto we've called it an infrastructure fund. I do agree with Stuart as well, though behaviour change is equally important, and the two hand in hand will, I think, deliver a lot more than if we just focus on behaviour change or just focus on infrastructure. On physical infrastructure, go back to a point that Nanette made, I would include green space, nature as part of that physical infrastructure. So it's not just the concrete and the physical bits of the infrastructure, it's also the green spaces and nature, because thinking about the joyous side of walking and what motivates a lot of people to walk, and you just need to look at your Twitter feed after a nice weekend of weather, it's absolutely stuffed full of people doing nothing more complicated than going out and having joy and fun walking. And often that includes green space, that includes a connection to a pond, a tree, a flower. So as well as the hard infrastructure, I think we need to focus on the green infrastructure, because that is a huge motivator. And it's also very, very good for our mental health, as we all know, that connection to nature, and also motivates us to have behaviours which are more likely to be environmentally friendly. So,
Nanette, any final thoughts on that before we end with the questions?
My only final thought is to remind people that Scotland's at the front of this. You know, I don't know of other countries that have a walking manifesto. We've had a walking development forum for several years. And that's why perhaps we're seeing walking progress and improve with more people doing it in Scotland. And the pandemic offers us that chance to build on it, to really build on people's lived experience now of enjoying walking more, and to build it back into their life. So if it's not this moment in time, when is it? This is the moment for a walking manifesto.
Here. Thank you, Nanette. So just in closing, I just wanted to reflect on the fact that we've heard from Nanette about the huge reach that walking has into the general population, that it really is one of the things that walking and wheeling is absolutely for everybody and can play an important role in minimising health and other inequalities. And that in part that could help us deliver walking as a way for humanity. I've completely lost that quote, Nanette. Will you remind me of the quote?
Humanity's best future, I think it is. Hang on now.
Humanity's way to a better world. My apologies. That was entirely my fault. I'm sorry to put you on the spot. From Ian, we heard about the critical role that infrastructure plays, the fact that we have to make walking safe and enjoyable for everybody, and a plug for that £50 million a year fund to help us deliver that. And Stuart talked, I think, and this is really important, about the risk that walking becomes invisible, that it's cut across too many silos, it's taken for granted, and the huge and life-changing role it can play is therefore overlooked, which is a travesty, particularly given that it is a serious form of transport. And I'm extremely grateful to all the questioners, both those who we were able to answer, but also the many questions, unfortunately, we didn't have time for. We're really grateful to you for joining this. And do please take away the manifesto. I'm sure you've read it already, but if you haven't, it's quick, it's short, it's 2 pages. Do have a read and share it with people, discuss it with them, and particularly talk to prospective candidates for the Holyrood elections about what they will